Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, and we're back with yet another build review video. These are usually pretty fucking long. It's at the end of the league when I've played all my builds, and this time around for Sentinel League I played 17 builds, which is a bit above average. We go anywhere from like 15 to 20 usually, I'd say. 20 is on the real high end though. But yeah, Sentinel League, it was the league that didn't have any balance changes, so it was going to be more of a struggle to put together some different sort of concepts and builds that could go all the way, especially since we got new content in the form of Uber bosses. Overall, it was a really good league, I thought. I had a lot of fun with the mechanic and the Uber bosses and all the builds I played, but I definitely would have liked a bit of balance changes because I was stretching a few times for a few builds and having a bit less fun because of that just occasionally. But overall, it still held up pretty well and I had a lot of fun. So that's Sentinel League wrap-up, let's just call it. Sentinel, good mechanic, hope it comes back at some point, especially recombinators and shit, but they were definitely fairly overpowered. So the first build that we are reviewing, I suppose, I guess we could say, my god is the bitrate terrible while watching this. That's just is what it is for this build, this type of build. Spectral Throw. I played it during the Arch Nemesis League, brought it back into the meta. Yes, you can thank me for that. Get fucked everyone else. Spectral Throw became meta this league, especially as deck stacking, because I rediscovered it and it worked really well with Sniper's Mark. So it just so happened that during this league, deck stacking got even more powerful with a Sentinel boot mod, but this build that I started out with was just a starter and it was a pretty humble version of Spectral Throw, so it was the first character of the league and I made it work off of like very meager gear, and ultimately it's something like 10 to 20% of an actual deck stacking build. But regardless of that, it did go ahead and take on a few of the Ubers. This is my first time actually doing any of the Ubers on any character, except for just testing it on standard. And yeah, look, it was slow, it was difficult, but it was doable. So that was pretty damn good for a very humble starter build. Spectral Throw went really well. You know, it was super fun to map with. I still recommend it. I'll probably be trying it out more in Sentinel as well. But the deck stacking is the far superior version to this build. So it was, yeah, you know, a bit worse playing it knowing that I'm doing an inferior thing. And then, yeah, the Sentinel boot mod made it even better. So what can I say? And let me correct myself real quick. I meant Lake of Calandra League. I'll probably do some more Spectral Throw action. But yeah, look, what can I say? Spectral Throw, I love it. It's, you know, still probably one of my favorite skills. Very happy that it was playable again last league and then this league. And should still be very playable next league in Lake of Calandra as well. The deck stacking Sentinel mod going away really doesn't matter. It was good before that. It'll be good after that. But I'll probably try out some Helix as well. So yeah, great build, good starter, could make it even better, all of that. So let's give it a bit of a rating to start with. Effectiveness as a starter, I mean, it's hard to not give it a high effectiveness. It wasn't, you know, super big DPS because it was just like a humble setup, not the deck stacking, so I guess we'll give it a 9. It was very good as a starter. It got through to Uber bosses. A 10 would be if I was like transitioning to deck stacking as well, but whatever. And enjoyment, I mean, that's a fucking 10. It's Spectral Throw. How could you not love it? And yeah, if I had a bit more DPS, obviously I would have enjoyed it more, but for me, it's pretty high up there for enjoyment. And budget, can it be a starter? I mean, it obviously was, but to get it to a point where it's doing like Uber bosses and all that, you need it to ramp a bit more and know what you're doing. So, you know, I can't give it mega points because I don't want it to be almost a 30 out of 30 when it very clearly isn't compared to some other builds. But still, that's pretty damn high. We got to give it a 27, and that's that. The next build was a bit of a meme that was just designed to kind of cosplay myself in the video game, and that is the Maroider, which was new MTX that came out. as a strength stacking, just bit of a joke, bit of a meme. Chris Wilson thought it'd be funny, and yeah, as soon as it came out, knew we had to make a build around it, and that was going to be just something pretty basic, strength stacking with Brutus Lead Sprinkler, and had to be Cyclone Shockwave. I went all the way with it, using Blunderbore, Massive Shrines, and the Gull. So it was just an absolute joke build. It really served no purpose other than to be massive. And it didn't do much, honestly. It was fun to kind of map with, but it was kind of weak. I just don't think Cyclone Shockwave is in the best spot unless you can really, like, go very hard with gear and the right setup. And this one wasn't it. So I didn't really recommend it to anyone or anything like that. Some people copied it and had a bit of fun with it, but for the most part, it was just a mediocre build and just a proof of concept for massive Maroiding and strength stacking BLS. So I don't know what to say about this one, honestly. It didn't do much, especially with Arch Nemesis being the way it was when it was just introduced into the game. Some of the like 2, 3, 4 mobs were pretty annoying and just not fun to deal with on a lower end build, something that was a little bit weaker despite how actually big it was. So I think that's enough of that. We'll give it a bit of a rate. Its effectiveness in the end was maybe like a 6. Like, it map cleared pretty nice, and anything big shrines and Gull absolutely will, but didn't do much damage and didn't really go too much of a distance for bossing and all that. The enjoyment was more about putting together the strength stack and also the I guess just novelty of the MTX. So it's fairly limited, you know, and it's just another Cyclone build otherwise. I'll give that like a 6 as well. Budget, could it be a starter? Strength stack, Brutus Lead Sprinkler, I mean, kinda. Not the worst, but still not great. Yeah, it's a pretty low score, and I think that's appropriate. Maybe a, 17? So yeah, a little bit of a letdown, but very fun, very cool MTX either way. The next build was a build I wasn't really planning on playing for a while, and that is Forbidden Rite, because I think I did it in Arch Nemesis, or at least recently enough, and I thought I'd done basically all that needed to be done with Forbidden Rite, but a new MTX came out for it, and it was literally like throwing cats, so wanted to do something with it, and the only way I could justify it was trying to do something really different, and that was self-casting it as poison. So I went with a poison Forbidden Rite Occultist just so I could do the whole cat slinging meme, and yet another bitrate destroying build, but then again, most sort of PoE successful builds these days are. If they're good, that's just how it is. So it was actually a pretty good build though overall. It surprised me with how well it went, especially compared to the last Forbidden Rite. Poison held up very well, the DPS was very good, the sustain was good, and it took on, I think, almost all of the Ubers in the end. Maybe it was a bit higher on the budget because it is tough to get a Forbidden Rite up and rolling to, you know, real good effectiveness. You can level with it if you got the right leveling uniques, but otherwise it is a bit of a struggle until you get there. I don't think it was super high budget, but you know, you need the right things to get it to the stage where it feels good to play, because until that point you just got a few problems in the build that need fixing continuously, and it never quite feels smooth or fluid during mapping, and you might be dying a lot. But we got it to that stage, and then yeah, you can see it's doing a Chiola, flawless Chiola. I think it was one of the first ones I did of the league. Yeah, definitely would have been the first one I did of the league, and previously I wouldn't have done many. And yeah, bitrate's just feeling terrific. So let's cut to a couple of bosses here or there. Took on all of my Ubers, which I think were the first time I was doing most of them, and it had really good DPS. The ramp, once it, you know, went off, just went hard. That said, this isn't ramp. This is, or not an Uber, sorry. It was more of a just tough Eater of Worlds to begin with. I think this would have been an Uber, possibly. But yeah, ramp time. Ramp was the biggest problem of the build because you needed wither up time and then a whole bunch of poison to kick in. So still not the best situation for high DPS builds, but it performed really well and it was pretty fun to play and put together. So I was happy with the build in the end, and it was just a really nice example of having another Forbidden Rite that was built in a slightly different way. So let's give that a rating then. It's a pretty successful one overall. Effectiveness, it's pretty high up there. Still not the absolute best, not the best DPS, bit of ramp, and also difficulty against some Ubers, but overall super fast on clear speed and really good DPS against most boss fights and all that. Enjoyment. Putting together another Forbidden Rite, not something I was planning on doing, just because they are kind of painful to put together, and then also, you know, taking that much damage without all the best gear. I'm going to say it's still like an 8. It's pretty fun with the new MTX. Budget, could it be a starter? You'd have to give that mostly a no. Forbidden Rites are really tough to start, but it's not the most expensive build or anything, so, you know, the budget wasn't mega high. But yeah, the problem with starting a Forbidden Rite is that you need to fix like Chaos Res, recovery, defenses, lots of shit, cast speed probably, until you can actually play it. And that is damn near impossible to do early game. So 21, I think that's fairly appropriate for that build. The next build I played was a bow build. Wanted to, you know, utilize the new Ellie sort of bows from previous league. I hardly did any of that. I'm not even sure I actually did anything in Arch Nemesis with buffed bows. But either way, bows got a substantial buff, and I did come across a nice bow, I think, from Rogue, and wanted to put it to use. So Storm Rain is something I tested out like half a year ago as some really good single target, but I didn't take it to its real highest degree, and I thought I was definitely going to do that at some point in the future, and really showcase some good bow DPS and single target. And yeah, it definitely went that far. I was actually surprised at how much damage you could pull out with the right sort of Storm Rain setup. And it wasn't that expensive a build, it's just fairly well put together for a good bow, and then, you know, some other damage sources and stuff. And it was some of the highest damage I'd done up to that point. And I think it took on pretty much all Ubers once again as well. So it was very fun to play. You know, not huge defense, as you could see, like 4k life or something, lots of evasion, bit of what did we do? Arctic Armor, I guess. And yeah, it was very fast play style, and basically just Storm Rain is, I thought, was pretty slept on. Not many people played Storm Rain, not many people took it very far. For some reason, it was more like Tornado Shot as the only thing people played with bows. But a nicely put together Storm Rain can have some of the highest bow single target in the game, I think. And it's not that hard to do, just get a good bow. Secrets of Suffering would be cool. That's going to get a slight nerf, but it shouldn't affect the outcome of something like this yet, because we didn't need that much crit from it anyway. So if we have any actual example of boss damage, like proper Ubers, yeah, it's also the only real problem I'd say with the build was more some ramp uptime as well, because it takes a little bit to get all of your Storm Rain damage down on the ground and then start ticking. But besides that, I mean, yeah, it did better than I could have really expected. Yeah, and you can see it's taking on the Ubers pretty comfortably. You know, can even take damage since you got Spell Suppress capped. And yes, I do believe this was the first clear of all of the Ubers for the league, because I think now looking back at this, I did not get Uber Exarch on the previous few characters, and I, you know, barely got Uber Exarch on this one as well. It's a tough battle without an overkill of DPS or defense, and in this case I almost had an overkill of DPS, but on softcore you can just kind of graveyard Zerg happily. And yeah, you can see the Minotaur not quite there. I was going to say you can see him dying, but this was not a good case of him dying, or a good showcase of him dying. Yeah. With the right ramp, feared all at once, all kinds of other bullshit, can kill stuff really quick. So yeah, Storm Rain is something I could easily recommend, maybe even as starters, but it's pretty slow to begin with. This isn't feared, this is a Synthetes, I think. No, wait, this is feared. think I did 2 feeds in this character, actually, is why there's several clips in the end. I think this is going to be some good DPS showcase with Maven, because you can pre-fire it, and then she doesn't move as much. Oh yeah, that's good uber damage right there. Oh, that was juicy. Yeah, that was some of the biggest single target DPS I had this league. So, Storm Rain effectiveness, I'm going to give that a 10. It's almost unfair to give it a 10 because it doesn't have amazing clear, given that it's Storm Rain, but it's still pretty fucking good. So, who cares? It was a very good bossing end game build, and, you know, as a bit of a hipster bow build, I think that deserves a 10. The enjoyment, I'll give it an 8. Secret Suffering does take away a bit of enjoyment when you can't shatter things, and there's a bit of ramp up time. You could be a bit tankier for proper enjoyment, but overall, still a very fun build. Budget, it's not the highest, not the lowest. I think you can start at something like this and get there after a bunch of upgrades. I'd give it a 7, so overall, it's a pretty high rating, I think. Makes it a 25. The next build that we are rating is Perforate Champion Impale. And this is a build that has a bit of ups and downs. So obviously it's melee, and I tried to make it a bit of a hipster melee. Perforate's something that not many people play, and then as well as that, Impale is in a pretty weak spot, and something I haven't taken on in a while. So I did use the fairly meta champion and meta form of scaling, so you know, armor, evasion, and I think perseverance belt, but it's Perforate and it's Impale, and as such it does have some pitfalls of just bad scaling at this point. Like I said, it's not very meta and it's kind of a bit weak at the moment, but it still went pretty far. I think we did 30 waves of Simulacrum in the end, is that right? 30 waves Simulacrum. Took on pretty much all content. It's a very thick sort of play style as a champion. Pretty nice for mapping, but ultimately it wasn't quite enough damage to justify being melee in Ubers, and as such it didn't have much fun doing Ubers. I felt the full force of being melee when I was taking on the Uber content, and it sucked. Like straight up rage inducing against doing some Ubers. And you do have to remember, not just remind yourself, but also remember that Uber content is very sort of optional. It's not something every character should be doing and every character should be measured against, but that said, it does hurt that some melee builds are going to be particularly bad against Uber content. As you can see, the DPS against regular content was blasting, and it's definitely capable of doing some big things, and against everything up to the Ubers, it was a bit of a face roll build. So it's still very strong to be melee, still very strong to be something like Perforate, but then you're going to come across some Uber stuff that makes you want to flip your table. That's about all there is to it, so it's pretty off meta. I think if it was a pure Ellie sort of Perforate, it may have performed better and then gone more of the distance on the Uber content, but it still performed well enough against a lot of the Uber content. It's probably the weakness of Impale at the moment, being not very impressive against the larger boss fights, and then when you have to sacrifice your safety, being melee, you really start to feel the low end of the scaling spectrum. So, not much else to say there, but Champion's still pretty good, Perforate's still going to be pretty good, and you can build it in better ways, I think, than Impale. So, effectiveness, I mean, it was still pretty damn high. Once it got to Uber content, it got lower, but I don't think it's fair to judge every build against all of that. Otherwise, the mapping was pretty nice, and the bossing was pretty nice against everything else. The enjoyment, I don't know, kind of just a melee build, no real shatters, impales, felt pretty vanilla, but smooth and comfortable overall, so still give it a 7. And the budget wasn't super expensive, wasn't super cheap, pretty accessible to most people, I'd say. I was using some very basic items like a Perfidy for a chest because I just wanted to do dual banners, Abyssus, I think, you know, a couple of weapons, and savior and stuff, so it's not too bad, and it can be definitely a starter. I mean, Perforate scales fairly nicely early on, so decent rating overall, I think, which makes it a, if I'm not too stupid, a 24. Am I too stupid? Thinking 22. Way too stupid. That's fine though. That does deserve to be about 3 points lower than Storm Rain. And the main difference, yeah, is just range versus melee, really. Otherwise, DPS is maybe half, but feels 4 times more because you can be at a range. So yeah, that's that one. Next build I did was an attempt at trying to make the triple damage staff work, which was pretty obviously good when it came out last league, but I didn't want to go too hard on it because I thought it was a bit too easy just to combine that, especially with Omni Amulet, since that was highly meta at the time, and then combining Omni with Annihilating Light triple damage staff was just an easy win for so many builds. So I went without Omni, and I wanted to do slightly off meta skills once again. So self-cast Arc for clear, and then Wave of Conviction for single target as an Inquisitor. Given that you could easily get 2 of those staves and 2 of those staves as 6 links very comfortably, I wanted to utilize the highly underutilized weapon swap technology, and as such I had Arc for pure clear and then Wave of Conviction for pure single target. Arc in this setup could even do some pretty good damage of its own, like maybe 10-15 million DPS, but the Wave of Conviction, when going all out just this one time, forgive me sensei, could do some serious damage. We're talking like 30-40 million DPS, I think, but it took a bit of, you know, the right circumstances to make it work. Like you had to have your intensify up, your something else focus up, you had to get your brand, your crits, your arcane surge. If you didn't have all of that up at the exact same time, obviously you wouldn't have your pinnacle of 40 million DPS, but you can see it was still ridiculous DPS either way, and I think it's one of the hardest hitting characters I've ever made. So it might not have the biggest DPS I've ever had, but just individually these hits could be like 5 to 10 million for just a Wave of Conviction crit. So Wave of Conviction was somewhat off meta, but looking at it, I saw a lot of damage potential on it for pure single target, and I wanted to make sure I at least gave it somewhat of a shot in a self-cast build. I think it did take on most Ubers. Let's see, holds up for Uber content. Yep. So we'll see if we can find anything there. But being self-cast and also not the thickest character in the world, it was fairly thick, but you're very self-cast, you do have to be fairly stationary, meant that it's not the best for Uber content, because Ubers do force you to either pure overgear them with damage, defense, or have a good playstyle. And in this case, self-casting, being pretty melee with the self-cast as well, because that's what Wave of Conviction calls for, being very melee, means that it's not terrific for Ubers. But it did everything else pretty well. Swapping into Arc made Arc self-cast a bit fun to come back to after all the years of not playing it, because it fell out of favor for a bit. And then, yeah, nice quick weapon swap to have big single target damage. Well, none of that's an Uber. That's an Uber Maven, I think. Maybe it's still not. Hard to tell without tabbing and seeing the right stuff. Oh yeah, did do Whole Grandmasters as well. So that's some good stuff too. Oh yeah, this is an Uber Cirrus, a full clear. Must have gone well. But yeah, not going to go ahead and sit and watch the whole thing. But if I include it as a video, it means we took on Uber Cirrus, which is pretty special stuff. That was a very shit boss fight to learn and start enjoying as your first time trying to get through it. So yeah, pretty good build. Let's give it some sort of a rating. Effectiveness, I think that's a 10, because you could have very good clear, swap of a button, have very good single target, and overall it was a fairly tanky build. for the type of playstyle. Lots of life, lots of armor, energy shield, mind over matter, eldritch battery. So yeah, pretty good stuff for all that. Enjoyment, I'd give that like a 9. It was pretty solid, having to arc and getting chains, and with Herald of Ice it felt very satisfying. And the budget, I mean, for the most part, I do think you can do something like this without much currency. You just need to save up enough time or effort to get the Annihilating Light Staves, and then fine-tune all of your gear to have it all the right stuff. And I do think that can be done as a starter, and I do think it can go even further beyond. So give that probably a 7 overall, because ultimately not the cheapest thing, and you do kind of want to, as a self-cast, thick, melee-ish caster, have all the right stuff before it feels good. So we're calling that a 26. The next build was an attempt at trying to make the Sentinel boots that have dex stacking mod somewhat ethical. And the dex stacking boot mod that we're talking about is 2 to 4 additional cold damage per 10 dexterity. So that, combined with the weapons, means that you could effectively double your damage on any of these cold dex stacking builds. Which, by the way, I made meta again, and no one really gave a shit about until this league. So I did it as Blade Trap. Blade Trap was always kind of a bit weird. It takes a lot to make work well, but I enjoyed it the first time I did it like a year ago, and wanted to make it for the past couple leagues, and finally got around to doing it again here as a sword dex stacking build. And it did about as good as I could have expected it to, but it still felt a bit lacking in some categories. It was an absolute visual nightmare if you wanted to make it one with the right MTX, and even without the right MTX, if you made it as friendly to the eyes as possible, it was still kind of a visual nightmare and gets a bit old to play. For what I did for it with the dex stacking, using the right sort of Sentinel mod and as much dex stacking as I could justify on somewhat of a budget, but still using a decent amount of currency, for all of that, it still kind of lacked in the end. Like, I needed it to completely obliterate single target. Instead, it just did decent, and then left you feeling like you're doing all of this for kind of nothing. I don't remember exactly how much it had, maybe like 10 to 20 mil, but I needed it to do more than that, and it just fell a bit short. So I think it took on some Ubers, it could take on all other endgame and stuff, but it just wasn't enough DPS to justify suggesting it to other people for dex stacking using the Sentinel boot mod, when you could have just instead played Spectral Throw, had a more fun build, and also had a better time playing a build that, well, I mean, I guess that makes the same sort of sense, more fun build. You just would have overall had more fun and more output is what I mean. Basically, this type of setup needed to be able to kill Ubers and various other bosses in one wave of traps before it went off, before the bosses did anything. And if it didn't, then you got in trouble. And a lot of time it came like halfway there. So it needed to go just a bit further, and it just kind of didn't. So ultimately, I'm not sure it even took on many Ubers. Yeah, but it cost a decent amount to get working. I think Blade Trap's still decent, but then again, you could have just played Seismic or Explosive and done like 3 times better off 3 times less. So that's why it wasn't super enthusiastic to like recommend it to other people, or to even finish it off. But I did take it as far as I could, killed like a few Ubers, and then moved on pretty happily. Dead. So to give it some ratings now, we have ourselves an effectiveness, I don't know, call it like a 7. It could do some single target, not the most. It could clear, not that well. But overall, it was just a bit above average, if, you know, average is like pretty bad. The enjoyment, yeah, I enjoyed putting it together to some extent. I enjoyed Blade Trap again and some of the visual nightmare, but like I said, it gets old after a while, so we'd give it like a 6. And then the budget, not really. You can definitely do budget Blade Trappers, but they're going to feel kind of bad, and then they do need to have a lot of boxes ticked before they get to a point where they feel decent. So it starts out pretty slow, and then it gets expensive to get to a point where you'd be happy with it, especially compared to some other trap builds where it just takes so much less. So it makes it feel a bit weird. So overall, that's a, you know, pretty whatever score. Give it a 17. Next build was Trickster Ice Spear. Now, I've played Ice Spear a couple times in recent memory because I played it or tried to make it as a self-cast Deadeye and kind of popularized it there, and it was really fun. And yeah, I needed to do something a bit different to make another Ice Spear. A new MTX came out, absolutely had to play with that, and this time around I tried to make it one of the least played ascendancies out there at the time, and that is a Trickster. So I was going for a real hipster approach to it, Trickster, but then a fairly meta way of scaling with a Trickster, and that is Eternity Shroud, which not many people do anymore because no one really wants to play a Trickster, and then even Eternity Shroud is somewhat underplayed at the moment. But I tried to go a little bit all out just to make it somewhat powerful as an option of a Trickster, and it went really well in the end. It was a fairly well-rounded build, had a decent amount of damage to the point where you could blow up some bosses instantly, had some okay recovery through Ghost Shrouds and Evasion, Grace and all of that, and it was sort of a hybrid low-life-ish style build. And then with the Eternity Shroud, it made gearing a bit interesting, so wasn't something you could easily replicate, but once again, you could have easily just played a Deadeye Ice Spear if you wanted a very straightforward, strong Ice Spear, which is probably comparable to this one in damage in the end. But this one was a bit more of a hipster example. And then, like I said, I was trying to make something work that pretty much no one's doing, and that was playing Trickster, and then especially as an actual just self-cast regular build instead of something like, you know, cold damage over time or chaos damage over time. So I was trying to reinvent the wheel a bit, and it did work out very well, but it was going to be hard to replicate, especially like a shaped snake pit. It's going to take a bit of effort. I happened to snipe it up for, I think, only a couple X, something like that, because no one's using that shit or trying to make Eternity Shrouds at the time. So it is still about being somewhat opportunistic in this game, you know, finding a niche in a market, exploiting a bit of a gap in an economy, and then making builds around that. And it's always going to be a lot worse to follow in someone's footsteps rather than discover that shit yourself. So the character ended up doing, I think, all Ubers, maybe not Exarch. Good time to skip to it. And as well as that, ended up playing a 2-player HP Maven, probably world first. I doubt anyone else has done that, with someone from my chat, a particularly special mod Blackjack. So yeah. Build ended up having a lot of fun, did pretty much all content, and just very effective overall. So give that one some ratings. We got ourselves the Trickster here. Effectiveness, I mean, it was basically a 10 because it clears very well, single targets very well, very fun to do all of that. The enjoyment, I'd give it maybe a 9. It could do a bit more for something. Deadeye, basically. The existence of Deadeye Ice Spear is probably what gives this -1 point, because Deadeye Ice Spear just has more fun, given that it's a bit faster and extra chain. Sniper's Mark is a bit more potent. So overall, still, Trickster just, you know, going to be a little less than a Deadeye. And then the budget, I mean, this version, not very budget at all, because I went with Eternity Shroud. Overall, as we know, Ice Spear, Deadeye can definitely be budget and a starter, but this one, not particularly. So we'd have to just say maybe a 5 or a 6. A 6, I'd say. Given that Ice Spear can be a starter, this one, not really. So still want to give it some decent score for that, even though this particular version, you wouldn't really classify anywhere near a starter. 25, not a bad rating. The next build was something that was once again trying to be pretty damn hipster, and that is Melee LE Hit, but as a Jug accuracy stacker. As well as that, went low life and petrified blood so that I could utilize replica last resorts. And I mean, it turned out to be somewhat of an interesting build. It was pretty tough to put together and fairly fun. Like, first time I was really going heavy on accuracy ever, I think. And then playing melee LA hit. I think I've done that a couple times before, and this one was a bit of a different take on it than I had previously tried. I think I found or bought a Skin of the Loyal that had certain amount of plus gems, and I was really trying to force some skill to work for it, and the only thing I could really come up with based off the colors is yeah, LA hit as melee. And either way, it worked out okay. The next video highlighted that it just isn't very good for like Uber and end game bossing potential, but it mapped pretty well. It was kind of fun, and then ultimately, yeah, it was a bit of a nothing build, really. I have played melee alley hit as a berserker before, and that was a complete world beater. Jug this time around, while being pulled in several different directions with accuracy stack and forcing the chest, just didn't feel quite right. Basically just on damage in the end, I suppose, because it did take on most content pretty well, but then it didn't quite have enough damage to justify being super melee, like much worse than the Perforate just earlier even. And yeah, started to feel the pitfalls of that in late game. Melee alley hit though, pretty good build, still fully doable. It can be a bit gear dependent, I'd say, to really come together before it becomes very nice, especially compared to the ranged counterparts of LE hit. Otherwise, you know, Jug and low life, and like for the amount of life I had, I was extremely thick because I did go a dual armor evasion sort of scaling thing, and yeah, it worked well enough for all of that. Not really sure what else to say about that. Bit of a mediocre build in the end, but a good attempt at something hipsterish. And yeah, probably give it some ratings now, and that would get effectiveness like a 7, maybe a 6. Nah, we'll give it a 7 because it did kill bosses up till the Ubers pretty well. It did clear very nicely too. Ultimately though, melee needed more damage, maybe a 7, and yeah, would have done worse than a ranged counterpart. The enjoyment, give that a 7 again. It was pretty fun to put together. Melee early hit and strike skills like this that you can kind of make work do feel pretty satisfying and fun up till a certain point. And then budget, could it be a starter? No. Pretty much no. We've got to give it some low ratings for that because, I mean, I pulled out a few stops to make this thing work, but you can kind of start LE hit in some cases, Slayer, some races and shit. I've done it in the past. But even with really nice gear and leveling gear, LE hit always feels kind of weak early on for some reason. It might have good numbers, it might have good gem levels, but then it still just doesn't feel like it's performing to what it should be doing, if that makes sense. It needs a lot of things to come together, like your strike range, the attack speed, the ailment effect, all kinds of shit, your crit, and then it actually starts to feel like it's doing something. So yeah, not super confident about anyone ever starting with that, though I think I have kind of in the past. The next one was actually a rather surprising build, and surprising in how it performed basically and how much fun it was, and that is Frenzy Wander Raider. So it was using the Ice Bite hat technology, so I picked up one of them Forbidden Shakos and just divined a bunch till some good things happened. Ended up making a few good ones and used one of them that was just level 34 Ice Bite, I think it was, with item rarity. So it was basically a 5-link, but as we all know, a very high level Ice Bite is super powerful. And then given that I was using one of those hats, I wanted to do something that wasn't an obvious win and still utilize, you know, some hipster technology, and that is Frenzy Wanding. So alt quality had some extra projectiles, and you can get some extra projectiles through Deadeye, and in the end I went ahead and tried to make Frenzy for clear, especially using Sniper's Mark, and then Barrage Frenzy for single target. So we stacked a lot of frenzies, we utilized Ice Bite pretty potently, and in the end it was actually a pretty damn good character, like surprisingly effective using Frenzy. You could get very good attack speed, you could get good clear, you could get pretty good single target, you could be a fairly ranged character, and it was satisfying with all of the shatters and the crunchiness. Thinking back on it now, it is going to be tough to recreate without recombinators, because the wand was pretty heavily recombinated. And then obviously divining is not really on the table for the hats anymore. You probably could just do regular 6-link and still pull off a pretty good build without a Shaco, but you'd have to look into the POB and plan all of that. But as you can see, like, the sort of playstyle on the single target was pretty cool with Sniper's Mark. It was kind of just another version of Ice Spear, but wanding with frenzies and stuff. And yeah, it was just a bit of a surprise package. So if you're going to try and pursue something like this, I'd say it's doable, but it's going to take a bit of work. And it took on all the Ubers in the end, which was a surprise to me. I didn't really think I had the damage for all the Ubers, but the playstyle held up. Like, you had some good sustain, you had good enough defenses, even though 4.5k life doesn't really matter. Had some good defenses otherwise, but the good playstyle and sustainability and being ranged meant that you can actually do mechanics of the boss fights. And yeah, I think it took on everything except for Uber Exarch. So it was a bit of a surprise package, not the biggest world beater of a build, but it was zoomy, it was satisfying, and effective in the end. So with the ratings in mind there, effectiveness, got to give it a 9. Not quite as much damage to fully blast dudes and do all the end game, but almost all the end game, and it cleared very nice, map very nice, etc. Enjoyment, give that a 9 as well. It was pretty damn satisfying. Like I said, crunchy, ranged, hipster, that puts together lots of enjoyment and satisfying. Can it be budget? No, I don't think so. But if you like played around with the POB, maybe it's something you can do pretty early on regardless. Ice Bite scaling, just flat damage scaling, Trinity, etc. It doesn't have to be this type of a carbon copy, but Frenzy as a range skill, I think, has some serious potential. So I think we could still give that like a 4 in the end. Not a bad score, but it, this, just the budget doesn't really represent how nice of a build it kind of was in the end. The next up was an attempt at being self-cast once again, but with Doryani's prototype, knowing that we could try and make something a bit weirder happen once again, and that is Shock Nova, and then go really thick for a character, so for everything except for lightning, even though you could go pretty thick for lightning in the end too. The gear was, not too hard to come by for Doryani's prototype this league with recombinators and stuff. Basically, you could make, talismans a bit nicer and a bit better, and then Melding of Flesh still existed at its potency. And even with the nerfs to Melding of Flesh coming, this is hardly affected by it, because I was over my max res cap by 2 or 3 anyway. But I think that was largely recombinator based. I could make a pretty nice shield. I could make some nice, amulets, gear, all kinds of stuff. Either way, basically this was supposed to be a Shock Nova character, and it was pretty successful for a Shock Nova build. But as soon as I started looking at and touching Crackling Lance, Shock Nova got a bit just fallen out of favor. We could do everything in the game with Shock Nova, except for maybe some Ubers and stuff. It cleared really nice, but then you were painfully melee with your single target, and also you were like kind of a slave to your intensify stacks that would do that proper sort of damage and positioning. And so like I said, while we could do everything, in the end, trying out Crackling Lance and then playing it, and as you can see, some fun shrine shenanigans as well, was just better. So Crackling Lance was just much more range and actually had more damage in the end too. And when you fully stacked up your intensify stacks and then went against bosses, you could do serious damage from range. So I think this build was maybe like 30-40 million DPS or something in the end. And then, yeah, the shrines were just a bit of a novelty. But if we look at some actual boss damage, once you get your intensify stacks up, it was chunking probably harder than anything I've had chunked before. And it was super satisfying to pull out that level of damage. I think Doryani's prototype is going to be very sort of meta as a super high damage scaling thing in the new league, because the mirrored stuff is going to just take it at minus 200 lightning res super easily. So there's still lots of hope for a build like this, or some Doryani's prototype scaling. And yeah, I think that's all going to be pretty good stuff. And Crackling Light's got a nice little girth upgrade, so I think it got a little bit wider. It doesn't particularly need that, but it's definitely welcome. Basically just try and get a bit of area and some cast speed, and typically you will be able to counteract the slight clear that it kind of needs, etc. But yeah, Crackling Light's bit of a buff, and should be even better. And right now it's already pretty damn good with or without Doryani's prototype, but Doryani's prototype lets you take it to like some really high levels. Effectiveness, I mean, a 10. I think I killed all Ubers, and it was pretty damn thick, had nice clear, pretty satisfying as well. Okay, you know, sometimes you had to care a bit about positioning and intensify stacks and stuff, and lightning damage. With the way I had my Dory's Proto set up, it was still a bit annoying for like constant lightning mirage, dude. And like Uber Eater, if you're unaware, Eater of Worlds, like almost everything in his toolkit has lightning damage, like portions and split lightning. So it's not very fun to try and tank that sort of stuff. But aside from that, we were pretty tanky and still killed everything. Budget. You can do Crackling Light stars for sure. This one in particular might be a bit tougher, but maybe with the new league it's not too bad. We'll give it, you know what, even give it a 6. I think basically any spell and lightning spell Inquisitor is pretty easy to start as a starter. It just takes some work to ramp higher and higher. So 25 for that total. Now this build here was full try-hard hipster mode, and that was trying to make Gluttonous Tide work. It's the shitty bow that was introduced with the Eater of Worlds, Searing Exarch, Gluttonous, whatever the fuck its name is. And it's just the bow that gives extra arrows for frenzy consumption, some shit like that. So it went like hard on frenzies, hard on arrows, and tried to play lightning arrow since it was a new microtransaction. And it ended up being just kind of good for clear speed, fairly whatever for single target, and basically just achieving nothing a regular bow build couldn't do anyway. So like it was an okay use of it in the end, like probably about as good as it could be. But if I just wore a regular Ellie bow, I'd have like probably more damage and just have more availability for like scaling everything else, defenses and all that. So it's still fun to play, but it was just kind of a regular bow build and a waste of like resources into trying to make it work in the frenzy arrow scaling sort of sense. So it was very weird, and just left me feeling roughly as I should have when trying to make that bow work. Yeah, it was fizz to Ellie scaling, where conventionally right now just actual Ellie scaling, lots of flat Ellie is going to be much more potent. So we had to put more work in for less result. And then yeah, the bow itself is basically just trash, as we've said the entire time. It just is unfortunate that it got released during the time when all other Ellie, flat Ellie on bows got buffed dramatically. So it was dead on arrival, essentially. But here you can see, yep, clearing nicely. Yep, bow build, lightning arrow. Can't really go wrong with that. Has nothing to do with the bow, though, unfortunately. So, may as well get this one over and done with. Effectiveness, I mean, it cleared nice. Kind of whatever, single target. I don't know what you call that, a 6, but you know, just because it kind of did anything a bow build would otherwise do. Enjoyment, it's fun to run around with the new lightning arrow MTX and kill stuff pretty quick, but no more fun than I would have ever played any other bow build. And then budget, regular bow builds can get to this level on a budget pretty well and just do decent clear. This one, you know, it's just a lightning arrow build basically. So I'm just going to call that like a 5 or something. Because I don't know, if you'd actually use a Gluttonous Tide when you first picked it up, it'd be super easy to get, but it'd still get outscaled by like some very weak bows. Call it like a 17, right? You know what, let's even lower that. It can be a budget starter, but we put some work into making this one a bit better. and got less result for it in the end, I think. We then come upon the GOAT of the league, and possibly even one of the best builds, or the best build I've played ever, and that is Cast on Crit Bow using Rain of Arrows and Blast Rain into Volatile Dead and Detonate Dead. It was a glorious screen cancer of a mess that cleared very well, very satisfying, as you can see, with all the volatiles just everywhere shitting out and chasing down your enemies. And then it also had probably the most satisfying, craziest single target I've pretty much ever had. I'm not quite sure, but it was, it's hard to compare when you've got builds that have all kind of achieved the same thing, and at a lower end kill bosses super fucking quick, like, the Guardians and regular end game bosses. But then when we went to Ubers, I think it also ended up killing Ubers like faster than anything else. I could kind of brute force my way through a lot of different shit. I do think there's still way bigger DPS builds out there. This one was probably something like 50 to 70 million, I don't know, but it was possibly the most I've had, and it utilized some of the basically biggest combos of damage that I could think of, and that would be Leadership's Price Amulet, Bow Cast on Crit, and then combining all of that with Detonate Dead and Volatile Dead. So currently Volatile Dead, Detonate Dead was like super OP just for, Ignite, and everyone was abusing that in a way that let you get lots of defenses and still have a super nice build, because you still had some damage thanks to Detonate Dead, Ignite, Spectre scaling. But I was all like, yo, why is no one playing this from a hugely damaged perspective? And there it is. I went in on it, went Necromancer Corpse Pact, stole that, went as an Elementalist. I only did that because it was cheap at the time. Corpse Pact was like a couple X, since not many people were utilizing this type of stuff in this manner, and it allowed me to make a very large example of Detonate and Volatile Dead. That is, of course, nerfed a bit to some extent. This next patch, I think corpse scaling is still going to be okay, not particularly bad, but maybe nowhere near as good as it currently is. This is trying to do the 200 Splinter challenge, and yeah, it got to a right mess. So yeah, it'll still be okay, but nowhere near what it currently is. That said, I think it'll still have more than enough potential as a build. It had so much overkill for almost everything I did. Otherwise, I think you could also do a Battle Mage version, which doesn't scale corpses at all, and instead scales just pure flat damage. I haven't looked into the POB on that, but I was tossing up when originally making this character between Inquisitor, Battle Mage, and just flat damage on a bow, or a serious attempt at something corpse scaling. And I think, yeah, that might still have potential, but you'd have to look into it yourself. Maybe I'll try it this league if I get around to it, something like that. But can't really go wrong. Bow Cast on Crit, that's always a very, very powerful way of scaling, with Asenath's hat and then just shaped bows and stuff. And this is build a league for me. Don't know if the scores could end up reflecting that, but effectiveness 10, as good as it got. Enjoyment 10, as fun as it possibly could have been. And then budget, I think you can do self-cast Volatile or Detonate for a while and then transition into Bow Cast on Crit, because it doesn't take too much. But then to min-max the build, it was somewhat difficult. Jesus, I think I still have to give it a pretty decent score, just so I can have a high score. But also because, yeah, you can do this on a much lower end and still perform pretty well. And maybe it's even worth looking into as kind of a starter. But build a league for me, for sure. And possibly build of the ever. Who knows? I do kind of like different play styles a bit more maybe, but this was just so much fun to have the absolute chaos that could deliver on screen. Next up was my first actual attempt, would you believe it, at Whispering Ice. It's been many years since this item and skill was in the game, and I'd always avoided it because it looked a bit bland. Well, first of all, it was strong for a while, and so there's no point in me playing that. You know, just established int stacking, very strong, thick build. And then the playstyle was just a bit bland. Run around, throw down some ice storms. That's it. But since it was kind of weak for a while and no one really played it, and I needed to do some sort of int stacking for the Brain MTX, I decided to go ahead and make my first ever Whispering Ice. And it actually surprised me with how A, effective, and B, fun it was. So you get very thick, lots of energy shield and decent defense with this style of scaling. Just lots of int and then, you know, energy shield and that sort of gear. But you could also have some pretty good damage and a pretty good playstyle. Like for the, you know, map clearing, it's a bit delayed because as you like cast out your ice storm, it takes a second to cast and then rain down the frost bolts. But you could fix that with Castwell Channel Cyclone. I just never did, so it was a bit clumsy in that regard, but you know, still fairly satisfying and fun. But then for bossing, it was actually a very good playstyle. You could be super ranged, you could be pretty tanky, and you could chill things and then run around and do some actual defensiveness. So it was also the first assassin I had played, or probably anyone had played in a long time, so taking an underutilized ascendancy. And then ultimately it actually killed all Uber bosses, which was a surprise because I expected this sort of kind of slow play style and not the biggest DPS in the world to fall a little bit more flat when it came to the high requirements of some Ubers, but it had good enough DPS. It was pretty thick, and the play style, once you actually got used to the fact that you're very ranged and you don't have to be like up close, it was fairly good in the end. It really does kind of matter about the overlap that you're doing against certain bosses. You know, if it's got a slightly bigger hitbox, it's going to guarantee you overlap a bit better, and then you'll do more single target in the end. So this is just one of the examples. Like I said, it's not the biggest DPS in the world, so it does still take some mechanics for these bosses, but the setup that you have allows you to actually learn the mechanics and then end up executing them, because a lot of room for forgiveness with 10k ES and being ranged and chilling and doing some sort of defensive setup. And yeah, I think Whispering Ice can be pretty flexible. We can do several different things with it at the moment, not just an assassin, not just crit, probably, etc., etc. So it was a bit of a surprise package. I didn't think I'd enjoy Whispering Ice or have it as good as it is, but still a bit low end on how plain of a, you know, setup and skill build that sort of thing is. Effectiveness, I'd give it a 9. It was pretty slow on clear without the castle channel setup, but very good otherwise. And even then, the maps went down pretty quick. It was just a bit uncomfortable having a delay. The enjoyment, once again, I did have fun with it. Not the most fun ever, but it was nice putting together an int stack, my first ever Whispering Ice, and shattering everything, slowing everything, being kind of thick. And then the budget, I mean, I think you can do these on a pretty good budget. You can, of course, go even higher. I think my assassin did utilize as much as I possibly could, I suppose, but on a budget, you're basically just having a slightly less DPS output and then like 8k energy shield instead of 10k. So it's pretty feasible, especially early on. But you'd be kind of slow as a character, I suppose. Maybe you can do it with some other ascendancies like an Occultist, Inquisitor, plenty of other shit. Either way, yeah, a fairly good package, I think, for a build. I then at some point got it into my head that I wanted to play Dark Pact and Skellies, and it wasn't on my radar at all. Like, I'd even thought about it earlier in the league and couldn't be fucked. But then I got it in my head that Bow cast on crit worked really well for the previous build, and I don't know, something overcame me that I wanted to do Dark Pact and see where I could take it. Kind of not really corpse scaling this time around, but Skele life scaling, and I took it to a degree of life scaling that I hadn't previously done, and that was with some timeless jewel stuff and impossible escape. So this was an example of a Dark Pact Skele that I'd tried before in the past, but taken to a much further degree than I'd ever actually had success with before. I'd always tried these like Spellslinger or some shit like that, and it felt a little whatever. This time around, it actually performed really well. So being a summoner, essentially, because I had some minions, Guardian, some Spectres, and all these other minions did make me pretty thick, even though I only had 4k life. I could sustain somewhat of a beating and had some good recovery. The clear was really good on it, and then the single target could have been a bit better, is my only real complaint. Like, I wanted a bit more for what I got, because it took a bit of ramp to get the Dark Pacts and your Withering like up and going against enemies, but it's kind of a small complaint, I suppose, because it still took on all the Ubers that were out there. It took on all kinds of silly endgame, and it was pretty effective. The only thing that it had going against it is with a similar sort of bow cast on crit setup, you were better off playing the volatile dead, detonate dead setup I had earlier. But if they're just standalone builds doing their own thing, this one's rated pretty highly. It was one of the better builds I played this league still. It would have been nice to have a bit more thickness, because 4k life, doesn't leave you much room for taking certain types of hits, but I did have high EHP either way. Like I said, just would have liked a bit more. And then once again, would have liked just a bit more single target, but can't really complain. It did take on all content out there. Even, Uber Searing Exarch, Uber Cirrus, everything was kind of crushed. Just needed a little bit more ramp, I think, maybe a little bit more DPS for its effort, and then it would have been damn near perfect of a setup as well. So, yeah, pretty good stuff. And I don't think almost any of it got nerfed this time around, because it's all minion life instead of like corpse life. So to give this one some effectiveness, give it a 9. I think it could have killed a bit faster on single target, been a bit thicker for general mapping, because that did get you in trouble occasionally. But I think it hit 94 or so effortlessly, not dying too much, just could get a bit uncomfortable against some arch nemesis crap. But your minions really do help in helping you keep alive. And given that I was scaling life, your AG was actually unkillable, like Uber Cirrus, all kinds of face tanking, everything. Don't think he could have died. We then went enjoyment. I mean, it was pretty fun compared to the other bow build. It was a little bit less so. So, because I played that one earlier, it does have to be kind of compared. But it was still pretty fun. It was very fun putting stuff together. I was kind of a summoner, but not a summoner. So it's nice to be towing that line and not quite going all the way in. And then budget, can it be a starter? You can do this type of stuff as starters, Poet's Pen, Spellslinger, even self-cast, and then transition into this thing. It's going to take a while to get to that point, but I do think Dark Pact and Skele's is possible early on. So it has to be a pretty good build overall, but not quite super high ratings. So if we factor all that in, I'm going to use my massive intellect to calculate that this went to a 22. I then did the unthinkable and played yet another melee build during the league. And melee's terrible and dead and whatever. And it was actually really good and really fun. And that's Wildstrike Champion. So yet again, Champion in a similar way to the way we just then scaled using the Perforate, except this time around, no impale bullshit, none of that shenanigans, and went with an axe, lots of flat ele damage, and then just flat ele across the board. So I picked an axe because it's pretty easy to get a high ele damage axe. No one's looking for them, and Rog can shit them out. And then I decided to also do axes for the Corpse Destruction Mastery, which is pretty fun. So I was actually a bit surprised in the end that Wildstrike scales so well so early on, because Wildstrike doesn't really need much to get its overall clear and effectiveness up. It just needs a bit of strike range, bit of attack speed, but overall it's like area and chains by default are actually pretty damn good right now. So maybe you could play it early on, but Wildstrike is going to be one of those things that needs a lot of everything else to come together to be good. This build wasn't very affected by the nerfs in the end. Like, the Reservation Mastery just meant I'd probably not run precision or vitality as high as I did, and then have to rely a bit more on the gearing. Otherwise, I lost a bit of armor and evasion, and it wasn't that much to actually care about. I talked about plenty of that in the video because this is a fairly recent build. But overall, it was, yeah, just actually really fun to play, and then a fairly decent build, even though it's melee. So people are pretty down in the dumps about melee and all that, and somewhat rightfully so, because there hasn't been any buffs or big, like, focus on it for a while. But that doesn't mean it's bad. It's still some of the, like, funnest, like, nicest sort of clearing builds out there, and it can be fairly high effectiveness on end game. The only problem is most melee builds are kind of bad against Ubers, but if you remember that Ubers aren't the be-all end-all of this game, and they were added as aspirational super end game content, then it doesn't really matter, because the build was like crushing regular boss fights, you know, your non-Ubers and your 4-ways and 5-ways and shit pretty damn well. It's just that when it came to Ubers, that requirement went up a notch and it became a little bit harder, and melee tend to feel those requirements more than the other things, because you need to have the total package, right? You need to have good defenses, good damage, good recovery, good playstyle, all of the above. So yeah, but otherwise, Wild Strike, pretty good. Champion, still pretty good. Axe, Ellie, Lightning, Scaling, surprisingly good. Don't think it quite got 30 waves in the end. I can't remember, but I feel like it got to wave 30 and died on wave 30, because the single target wasn't that impressive. It was maybe like 5 to 10 million in the end, and yeah, that can get you in trouble on a couple of the larger bosses, but very thick character otherwise. And yeah, the champions that are thick like this are usually some of the best to take on Simulacrum. So that's that one, and we should rate it. Effectiveness, in the end, give it like an 8, because it needed a bit more for the super end game, but everything else was really good, and still kind of melee. So even for that everything else, sometimes it was a bit too melee, you know. The enjoyment, I'd give that like a 9. It was pretty damn fun to play. Wild Strike, once again, one of the funner melee skills out there once you can get it rolling. And then budget, I think you can do a pretty low end one, but obviously to take it to the proper end games and all that, it's going to need more work. So not a terrible score at all. Is that also a 22 then? Yeah, look at that. Same thing as before, basically, except slightly reversed on the effectiveness and the enjoyment. So isn't that a bit surprising, I suppose? You know, you can have something that goes all the way through all the Ubers, kills everything, but the enjoyment's just a little bit less than something that kills none of those Ubers. I think I still killed a couple of Ubers on this character, but it could just be a bit more fun as melee either way. And then lastly, this is the build I just then finished playing right at the end of Sentinel League, and that is Spellslinger Inquisitor using Battle Mage and just a big flat LE wand. So it was, let's have a look. A pretty damn fun and pretty damn effective build in the end. I wanted to use like LE wand as a sort of scaling source for, man, that bit rate is terrible. Scaling source for my spell damage and my Spellslinger. So I just grabbed a tri-LE wand and then went to town with pretty much any spell you could get your hands on and just feel things out. So originally it was kind of Ice Spear and I don't know, some other stuff, but in the end it landed on Rolling Magma after I tried a bunch of different spells, and Rolling Magma actually felt really good. So I had a Spellslinger set up for Rolling Magma, a Spellslinger set up for Ice Spear, and then another Spellslinger, no, a Cast on Crit for Rolling Magma. So there was 3 spells and Kinetic Blast for the trigger. And it was really fun. I played it right till the end of the league, played just extra, just mapping for no real reason, because I could, because it was pretty fun to map with, and I kind of wanted to play PoE, and there was no PoE to play yet because the league is coming very soon. So I kept playing and just mapping for fun because it was pretty damn satisfying. It mapped like an absolute beast. It bossed pretty well for a low life character. It had some good sustain and tankiness, and yeah, the footage is just going to be a bit rough given how much stuff is always happening on screen. But You can just watch the video if you're more interested in it. It only just then came out. Otherwise, it's probably time to give it some rate. Effectiveness, give it a 9. It could have had a bit more single target for some of the Ubers and stuff, but I think it took on almost everything. Didn't bother doing the last few. But it was pretty damn fun and pretty damn good. Enjoyment, give that a 9 as well. You know, slightly less than maybe like Spectral Throw, maybe the Cast on Crit Bow, but overall it was pretty fun and satisfying to just run around, spell sling, shit out spells everywhere. And then budget, I think you can do some budget spell slingers. I still haven't really tested it, but you'd be like probably leveling Rolling Magma or Ice Spear or something until you get the spell slinger up and rolling. The kind of idea of this build was to make it nerf proof for the next league. We already saw the nerfs and I adjusted accordingly. So the build doesn't have mana reservation mastery. It is using Spellslinger, which gives it more damage so that you can have less gear basically next league compared to the current gear. So I think it can probably be pretty good on the low end still. And as such, I'll give it a 6, but I'm not quite sure how it actually performs as a starter, which is why I don't quite know yet. So in the end, something like 24. So with that, I think that's it. 17 builds all done and dusted and rated, and build a league is going to be the Bow CoC DD. But lots of fun builds in a meta that was supposed to be kind of stale, and you know, 2 leagues in a row without real changes. I still found lots of things to do and found lots of builds, and there was still actually a few I didn't get around to and would have liked to have made, but it is kind of, you know, a bit hard to keep going and be super enthused to play lots of PoE when you're 90 days into the league and there's more new content coming. So I wasn't playing quite as much as I would have, you know, otherwise wanted to be right at the end, but I was still playing plenty and having lots of fun and looking forward to a new meta. But this was a pretty damn good league, I think. Overall, Sentinel was a good mechanic. The league itself was good, and the game was in a good state after all of the arch nemesis got ironed out a bit, though I will say I still wanted a few other arch nemesis changes, some stuff to get removed, some stuff to get toned down. I think the arch nemesis changes that are coming are about as good as things are going to get, and probably won't really have room to complain anymore about the current state of all of that. So that's the build rating review video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys enjoyed the build content for the league, and hopefully we got some good stuff coming in Lake Calandra. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.